I don't want to take up the floor with too many announcements. It's already there on our website, marxedproject.org. We're going to hear from Peter now, who will speak for 25 to 40 minutes. There's so much in the book, so many things to be concerned with, and I'm looking forward to both hearing from Peter and our discussion. And Peter, the Zoom room floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to all the folks who showed up, and also the folks who have kept this forum going in one form or another for so many decades. It's really valuable to have spaces like this. So my book, the solutions are already here, Strategies for Ecological Revolution from Below. To simplify, I can divide it into 3 parts. It has 5 distinct chapters, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'll talk about like the three main thrusts, or the main areas that it explores. The first consists of criticisms of mainstream responses to the ecological crisis. First of all, the very way that it's talked about and defined. Ecological crisis is not a framework that's used that often. Much more often we hear about climate change, and then within climate change we hear about carbon emissions. So it's a much more technocratic approach to the problem that really weeds out a lot of the factors that are all wrapped together in what's happening that's threatening life on this planet, that's causing like a huge amount of suffering and death and impoverishment and immiseration already, that's causing extinctions at 10,000 times the background historical rate, that's causing the loss of a lot of ecosystems, a lot of ways of life, destruction of the commons. And so there's so many factors that are wrapped up in that ecological crisis, and carbon emissions are definitely a part of that, and climate change is a major part of that, but it's not the only thing. And as we see in a lot of specific cases, when you have a more robust ecosystem, then it's more able to adapt to and to survive climate change, or even to moderate climate change. It's more able to absorb carbon and other greenhouse gases. So it really only makes sense to have that reductionist technocratic view from the standpoint of these technocratic institutions that have access to, you and I in our living rooms, we probably don't have the materials, the equipment that we need to measure, parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But, people, social formations that do exist in a relationship with the commons, with their ecosystem, we are able to notice changes and to measure changes that are happening to our surroundings, that are happening to the land, to the weather, and so forth. They're just not in these technocratic ways. So it's an approach that from the very beginning disempowers popular action and community action around these problems, or even understanding of these problems, and puts us in this very passive role of waiting for the information that's coming from the experts. And there is a place for that information. Of course, there is a place for scientifically produced information in all of this. But the way that the information is packaged and the kinds of information that are deemed legitimate or not legitimate are already going to be predetermining who can be active in responding to the problem, what institutional framework the problem is going to be responded to within, and all of that. Another thing that I kind of alluded to already is that it's often talked about in the media as a future problem when it is very much an ongoing problem. It's a problem that, especially if we take this broader ecological look, and even more so if we put it within an anti-colonial framework, which I think we have to do. It's a problem that we can see the signs of going back hundreds of years. And when we sort of just look at it on the television or within the framework of the IPCC or the United Nations format, then they talk about we have 5 years left, we have 3 years left, et cetera, et cetera. And so, who has that amount of time left? Because it's not the tens of millions of people who are already dying every year because of famine, because of drought, because of floods and other extreme weather events. That like they don't have that time left. Like they've already died. There's species that have already gone extinct. They don't have that time left. So I think it's very important to put it in a framework of understanding that this is something that's already ongoing, that has very deep historical roots, connected to capitalism, connected to the state, connected to patriarchy, and the process of colonization that globalized all of those forces. And it's a problem that we're all impacted by, and that we all should be responding to. But we're trained, and essentially we're also packaged in a way that we just have to passively take whatever meager tools that they give us, which are largely related to ethical consumerism, green capitalism, voting for one political party or another when there's a very small amount of difference in the sort of proposals that they're willing to consider. So so much of the official institutional solutions to the problem are really just reflections of the problem, and in a lot of ways they're strategies to further the problem and to reproduce the problem. So green capitalism, for example, is great for making money. It's great for increasing surveillance and social control over a territory. It's great for creating more effective forms of energy production for a capitalist economy. It's not that effective for actually mitigating or stopping the ecological crisis. So right now across the world, the production of green energy, the production of renewable energy, is one of the great drivers of habitat destruction, of immiseration, of human communities, and all these other interconnected problems that we're talking about. So there's a great need to criticize green capitalism, and to criticize the way that the official institutions, even though they are, contrary to like the right-wing paranoias about climate change being some big old hoax, scientific institutions are, they are spreading information that is very precise. But in fact, they've been largely conservative in their estimates regarding global warming, and also there is an operation going on there when you reduce a very multifaceted problem to the much more simplified problem of global warming. So the first two chapters of the book primarily look at those mainstream ways of limiting how we understand the problem, and suggest other theoretical frameworks for looking at the problem. For example, frameworks coming from anti-colonial struggles, frameworks that look at counterinsurgency and social control. So sort of like social war theory, drawing, on the one hand from, thinkers as diverse as Franz Fanon or Alfredo Bonanno, to, the counterinsurgency experts that the state, that various states have relied on to increase their strategies for maintaining control in the face of conflict and crisis. Whether that was the British in Kenya, the French in Algeria and Vietnam, the US in Vietnam, and how in fact, there's this common idea that governments haven't been taking climate change seriously. And there's validity to that idea, but that also is an incredibly charitable view that leaves out a huge part of the story. The US government began taking climate change seriously on certain levels already in the 1960s. Already in the 1960s, you have US government administrations looking at the problem and saying this is a big problem and we need to take it seriously. And we're not just talking about, the Department of the Interior, we're talking about the Pentagon. We're talking about how from the beginning they've looked at it as a security problem and seen the necessity to take it very seriously on that level. European governments, NATO-aligned governments, going back to the early part of this century, have talked about how they need to further militarize the borders because of the ecological crisis, and even use that crisis to normalize the use of the militaries in domestic urban operations by 2020. So that was something that NATO governments in Europe were already talking about, roughly 20 years ago. And you saw, for example, Italy was particularly eager to deploy this change. So in the face of earthquakes or other supposedly natural disasters, they would normalize the use of the military. So they've been taking it seriously for a while, but they see it primarily as a security problem. And so this whole environmentalist NGO framework, they're only just beginning to actually look at it as a human problem, but they tend to reject any kind of deeper framework that would look at how governments actually do take it seriously, and that's a very bad thing for the rest of us, in fact. So yes, that's the first section of the book. The second part I want to talk about, which is the third chapter, that's the biggest chapter in the book. It's sort of the bulk of the book. Thanks to a whole lot of support from comrades from all around the world, I was able to conduct interviews with struggles, with people who have participated in struggles from Brazil to France to Indonesia, and that for me is really the most promising thing going on right now, is that there are a lot of movements that have managed to take on and defeat concrete instances of this sort of socioeconomic machine that's the driver of the ecological crisis. So, for example, major airport being defeated in France, or mining projects being halted in Germany, mining and logging projects being stopped in Brazil. I was able to do an interview with some anarchist comrades who have a shared project with Guarani communities in Brazil, and their lands, their traditional lands, were some of the first to be conquered, to be invaded and occupied by, in this case, by the Portuguese, and so their lands have been subjected to very ecocidal economic practices that are connected to to colonial capitalism for hundreds of years. And so it's not a story of groups of people defending, for example, rainforest that still exists. It's Guarani communities that are recovering their land that has been exploited by plantation economies or by mines for hundreds of years. They're recovering their land, and they're engaging in processes to heal that land. And so that means often a combination of practices of food sovereignty or food autonomy, with practices of habitat restoration, like reforestation. And food autonomy is really important because that's one of the most important ways that people on the bottom of social hierarchies, poor people, colonized people, can sort of reinvigorate the commons and really create direct access to their own means of survival without the need for reliance on wage labor or extractive industries, so they can feed themselves and then increase their ability for fighting back against capitalism. And when it's in this sort of anti-colonial framework, like when you're recovering their lands, that's hugely important, just on all the different levels that we could talk about, but also like specifically with within the ecological level. It's taking land that has just been made infertile by capitalist practices, and it's turning land into an ecosystem again, into a carbon sink that can really mitigate climate change, into habitats for many other species, and into habitats for human communities that are organizing themselves in anti-capitalist ways. And so there are anarchists who are outside of the city, who have relationships of solidarity with these Guarani communities, and they help each other acquire resources. Each group sort of has access to like a different pool of resources. They help support each other against state repression or repression, parastate repression coming from the mining companies and the logging companies, for example. And so that was one of two interviews I did with comrades in Brazil. The other one with the group Terra dos Povos, which is also featured in the book. And just really inspiring examples of people who are using direct action and solidarity to actually reverse some of these trends of extractivist industries and bring about the kind of world that would actually be worth living in, and that would be possible to live in for human communities, for other natural communities with a lot more species. So that's one example. I alluded to the ZAD, the Zone to Defend in France, which blocked a major airport project. And so this was a really broad coalition between anti-capitalists of various stripes, local farmers, environmentalists, and they were able to stop a major airport from being constructed. And in the process, they inspired dozens of other ZADs that popped up around mostly French-speaking areas, so France and Switzerland, for example. Some of which also stopped, infrastructural extractivist projects, and that's really important. One thing I want to say within the interviews for the book, I am trying to like create a sense of that there is hope. There is reason for hope. At least there are battles that are being won, and I want to sort of point the way towards imagining what that would look like on a larger scale. But I also didn't want to paint an exclusively rosy picture with these interviews. So a lot of the interviews talk about repression that these communities face. For example, one of the comrades in Indonesia who helped out with interviews there about Dayak communities fighting back against palm oil plantations in Borneo. One of the people who helped out with that actually got arrested after the interview took place. And so, some of the work around the book has also been just trying to do support for people in prison. So that's a very real part of this problem and these struggles, is that they are impacted by repression. There are people who are killed or jailed in the course of these struggles, and sometimes some of these struggles are going to get shut down by state repression. And it's significant that the environmental NGOs, or the mainstream part of the environmental movement and Extinction Rebellion and groups like that, typically say nothing about, or very little about, that repression, except in a few media-friendly cases where you have organizations that are involved in peaceful protest, and then they railroaded and imprisoned or killed. But anytime that you have communities actually fighting back in defense of their collective survival, then most of these mainstream environmental groups are in a way complicit with that repression, and they remain silent on it. So I don't try to present a rosy picture, and that also means questioning what victory means. So if you can cancel an infrastructure project, that's great. But if you do that in a way that in the end you're coming to some kind of agreement with the state or with the dominant economic powers, and you're taking like an incremental victory and an institutional victory where some kind of mega project gets canceled, but in exchange for that you're basically giving up the autonomy of a movement, or ending like a land occupation that was maybe really generative of new social relations, new ideas of how to exist in relation with other species, in relation with the land, in relation with one another. Then I think it's worth questioning, was that worth it, and to what extent that was a victory? Because what we really need are working practices of thriving commons, of communal horizontal relations, with the land, with other species, and within human communities. So there's a bunch of interviews in the book from North America, from Europe, from South America, Asia, and in addition to that, a lot of research where I wasn't able to arrange direct interviews, research about existing struggles, for example, struggles against the petroleum industry in Nigeria. So that's the bulk of the book, and so the idea is that a lot of these struggles are already going on. So the climate movement, it's not a new thing, but it's been newly repackaged in a way that actually invisibilizes or disempowers what I think are the most intelligent, the most inspiring, and the most deeply rooted movements and struggles that have been going on all around the world. So those struggles exist. The important thing is to encourage them, to spread awareness about them, to spread the models that they develop, to help them get into touch, to create more global solidaristic relations, and then to use those models everywhere possible. And so I was also trying to tease out some of the salient features, some of the most relevant practices that I think we see in a lot of those movements, and practices especially that allow solidarity, beyond any one political party or political current, that allow solidarity across the globe, between people speaking different languages and inhabiting, different ecosystems and being faced with very different exploitative economies. Also different state contexts, like whether you're in a more democratic state where the repression is, using more soft tactics, or whether you're in a state, with frequent use of paramilitary violence, for example. And so despite those major differences, a lot of times we see that these movements that are using some of these characteristics, they're really able to understand each other, and they're really able to build effective solidarity. Um, so then the final two chapters in the book are looking at what those salient characteristics would mean for like a stronger global movement, and also what they would mean for a transformation of world societies if, as movements were able to abolish capitalism and defy the power of the state and create societies that were actually designed to ensure the health and well-being of their members, and to ensure the health and well-being of the land and the habitats that we rely on for our survival. So I criticize technocratic approaches in the book, and parallel to that, when talking about how to talk about the future, how to talk about proposals to the ecological crisis, I try to remain consistent and also criticize the practice of ideating a blueprint, which is meant to be globally valid and can be imposed, on the world as a whole. That brings up potentially really interesting questions about intelligence, about organization, and about how institutions circumscribe knowledge. So what is the advantage of the blueprint approach? Also, for example, like Deleuze and Guattari have written about, with like medieval stonemasons, like, shift and between different paradigms of knowledge, between like a sort of more situated building from within to like the blueprint approach, where you can abstract a plan and then impose it on the territory, which, obviously is going to have certain advantages, but it comes with it a much more authoritarian practice, or an authoritarian relationship between the designer of the plan and those who execute the plan, and then, often left out of the equation, the territory that the plan has to be imposed on. So that territory has to be flattened as much as possible so that it's not even an element, it's not even a player. And then the blueprint is often, funneled through various knowledge systems so that it can be made systematic, so that those who implement the blueprint, can be increasingly like unskilled, exploited laborers who are following basically like systematic, reproducible instructions. And then that concentrates all the power at the top among those who are crafting the blueprint. On a wider social scale, when it comes to things like, climate change, we see the exact same thing, that the sorts of solutions that require all of our activity and all of our intelligence and knowledge of the territory, from the territory, those are precluded from the get-go, whereas the kinds of supposed solutions that require the sort of blueprinting authority that imposes the plan on the territory, those are generally the only solutions that are considered. So government agencies looking at a map and saying, okay, well, this rural area over here, it doesn't have a lot of tourist income. It's not very valuable territory. The farm fields there, they've all been farmed to death, and like a ridiculously high proportion of agricultural land globally has already been made infertile by industrial agriculture. So it is kind of strange how few people nowadays are like recognizing that industrial agriculture is actually a failed system. It's not that it might fail in the future, but it's already a failed system. So anyway, so we're looking at this territory that's already infertile. It doesn't get a lot of tourism bucks. Let's fill it with wind turbines, for example, or let's see if there's any lithium to be mined there for batteries. So that's a solution that's relying on the kind of statistical information that's available to government institutions. It's relying very much on there not being input from territories, because if every given territory were able to block a certain plan, there aren't many territories that would willingly surrender themselves over to lithium mining. And it's a form of organization that it's unable to have access to specific and rooted intelligence. So pretty much like nowadays, pretty much everyone who's talking about like intelligent forms of organization, like computer scientists to biologists studying fungal networks, pretty much everyone except within the political sciences acknowledges that decentralized systems with high connectivity are the most intelligent, that you don't get the most intelligent outcomes when decision making is centralized within a smaller part of the overall social or ecological body. So the most intelligent computers are the ones that allow the highest level of communication between the components without it all having to go through central processing. It's been increasingly shown how entire ecosystems or specific organisms have a high capacity for intelligence, when there's decentralized communication throughout the organism or throughout the body. So it's kind of, it's sort of this disconnect within the sciences that in general, everyone knows that decentralized networks lead to the most intelligent outcomes, the best information sharing, and the best access to knowledge, especially, if you're thinking about, for example, whether it's sentient creatures or whether it's like sensors in a computer, like direct access to the local information. Ant and bee colonies, for example, there's been interesting studies about decision making within those groups and how it's based on the individual worker ants and worker bees just constantly sharing information about like their own subjective take about possible food shortages or locations of food and other resources and so forth. So there's no one within the bee colony or the ant mound that has the bird's eye view, and in fact it's in their interest to stay out of the bird's eye view since the bird is the one eating them. And they're able to make the most intelligent decisions on that basis with sort of a rooted, territorialized or subjective intelligence shared in a decentralized network. So basically, scientists across the board are approaching pretty much a consensus around this model of intelligence, but it just does not at all penetrate into anything related to political sciences or anything related to how humans are supposed to make decisions, because we're supposed to make decisions basically following the blueprints of elite institutions, academic institutions, and government institutions. And that has a huge corollary in the official solutions to the ecological crisis, which tend to be solutions that actually just exacerbate ecological problems, and they exacerbate social human problems. And they're often not that good even at dealing with climate change, but they're very good at maintaining these sort of hierarchical and institutional power relations. A great example of this is carbon capture technologies. The primary, and this is again something that a small community, we wouldn't really be able to use these technologies on our own. These are technologies that only make sense at scale, and so they're going to be technologies that are most available to the very companies, the very organizers of economic activity that are most to blame for the ecological crisis. It's become a new opportunity for them to profit, and the major use of those technologies, has actually been to increase the output of oil and gas wells. So they liquefy carbon dioxide that's extracted from the atmosphere, which should be bringing down carbon levels in the atmosphere, but what do they do with these gases? Where do they store them? Oh, well, oil and gas wells are a great place to store them, and we can use that to pump out more oil and gas. So that's just the perfect example of the supposed solutions that are coming from dominant institutions, and that constantly treat the territory with disrespect. Whether these are like poor and indigenous communities living in the territory, or whether it's non-human life, the land itself, and that that's not a coincidence that we're dealing with a crisis in which other than human life and also humans other than middle and upper class Western societies are being threatened. And then the dominant institutions, the solutions that they're rolling out are all of them predicated on the very same disrespect, the very same extractivism and exploitative tendencies. So to kind of wrap that up, how I talk about it in the end is, so for the past 15 years I've lived in Catalonia, outside of Barcelona. And so I decided, instead of to talk about, what's the solution going to look like on a worldwide scale, but then also, not to just, look at like, oh, well, in our own little garden, we can, find the solution. I tried to sort of engage in an imaginary exercise that has one foot in the global and one foot in the local. And so I imagine a process of a couple decades with revolutionary movements that are able to abolish capitalism when it is in its moment of a lot of crisis from just all of the contradictions that it produces. And what that would look like, in the first few years, when, we're dealing with like the very real scarcity of transitioning from a system in which food comes from the supermarket, and from halfway around the world to a situation in which we have food autonomy and, we're providing for most of our food. And then, to like, 20, 30 years down the road when there's, been a lot more time to make those transitions and to live with abundance, what abundance would look like in a completely anti-capitalist society based on taking care of the commons, based on making empowered decisions about what technologies we want to transform and adapt once we have the power to do that, and what technologies we consider just to be harmful, what new technologies get developed. And one of the considerations that I think is really, really important, especially if we're writing from the global north, in like the first few years, how do we help our comrades, and how do we help folks on the other side of the world, folks in colonized countries, folks in the global south? How do we help them survive that transition? Because in Catalonia, which has access to a lot of industrial infrastructure, it'll be a lot easier for us than, for example, it will be for people living in Western Sahara or people living in Venezuela who are, have these economies imposed on them that are, just absolute dependence on the global economy, on these global processes. So for example, taking a cue from, early on in the pandemic, actually workers took the initiative in some automotive plants in Catalonia to repurpose their machinery to make respirators and things like that. So this was one of these great examples of worker self-organization early on in the pandemic, being much more agile and certainly much more solidaristic, helping provide these resources and helping move from scarcity to abundance when there just weren't enough masks, weren't enough respirators, and all the rest to go around. So taking a cue from that, I imagined these workers taking over factories, repurposing them to not to produce like the consumer goods that people all over the world now are unfortunately dependent on, but to produce like simple machine parts that would allow, for example, folks in South America or folks in Northern Africa to move towards self-reliance or to move towards autonomy. To basically, for example, a lot of these places are producing foodstuffs, but they don't even have the machinery to process their own foodstuffs. So, for example, the simple machinery that would allow them to carry out those processes and to not be vulnerable to starvation because they're dependent on this global network that only ever saw them as a colony. So for example, and you have the port of Barcelona. So imagine like seizing these big ocean-going cargo ships and carrying out shipments to help other territories achieve that self-reliance, not in any kind of isolationist framework, but within a global network of solidarity, but one in which really in terms of like efficiency, like basic efficiency, there's no reason for populations to be getting the vast majority of their food from the other side of the planet. So there are a lot of transitions that I think need to be made to move towards much more localized economies and self-sufficiency, but always within a global framework of communication, of solidarity, of sharing, and really the inspiration for that, or the sort of seeds of that model, are the kinds of international solidarity that already exist. They're the kinds of solidarity missions that already rise up when there's a movement that suddenly gets stronger, that takes some space, and that puts out a call for help from the rest of the world, whether it's in Chiapas and Oaxaca or Kurdistan or elsewhere. So those kind of relationships, they already exist as seeds for the kind of things that would need to happen at a larger scale and in a more important way. If we are able to experience some kind of acceleration around both the collapse of capitalism and the deployment of our own strategies for survival and beyond survival for life.
Thank you, Peter. So everybody, if you have questions or comments, just write the word stack or use the raise hand feature that is available in the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screens. And I'm waiting for one person to ask something before I ask anything. Well, so Peter, I found your presentation covering these movements very encouraging. The movements like Christiana in Copenhagen and Zod in France and some of what you have described in Indonesia seems to me that we need, as those who are in the broad anti-capitalist movement, whatever our orientation, we very much need to start having a not just a defensive organization and you know around the planet, but we need to be much more aware of these movements so that we can lend support. Especially at moments when, like, the Macron's government or whatever local governmental authority decided to bulldoze the wonderful Zog community, or the Danish authorities took apart the Christiana network. It was very hard to get support networks together. Mm-hmm. And what echoed through your presentation was the infrastructure we need to make is much like, not that we all need to become permaculturists, but there is something from the permaculture movement that brings with the science we learn about what we can do to transform our world into intense biodiversity with regionally biological viable planting, treatments of the soil, bringing sunlight in, various things that I feel in some ways are very related, but on a micro level to what you're doing. And I'm aware that there are some fissures in the permaculture movement with this or that, but there's fissures in every kind of movement we get going. The crazy sectarianism on the left, I see at some of the large gatherings that we have for the the ecological catastrophe, often have sides that oppose one another, and there are some of our eco groups that I do feel aid and abet, especially on the green capitalist side, the furtherance of our decline, not just our species, but parenthetically, what you're talking about is not just species decline, but one of the impactful parts of what you were explicating were the growing number of dead zones, where life needs to be restituted in some way, where we as a collective, as a species, need to get to those areas like Northern Adriatic, I assume off the coast of New Orleans. Perhaps the entire New York Harbor will become dead or unsupportive of life. And when we hear of things like the microplastics at the very depths of the Marianas Trench, as you said, the daily deaths from all of this hyperdevelopment and breaking of the metabolism on our planet are something we have to act on now. So do you have any idea of there being a global network that is developing? I mean, you've done the interviews. Are the groups in these various countries, say Indonesia, Brazil, France, is there a vibrant communications solidarity network developing between these movements? And if so, how is that developing?
Yeah. So there are, I would say that there are networks of communication and solidarity. I'm not sure if we could yet talk about like a network, but there are increasing number of connections with an increasing amount of communication happening. And yeah, the fact that, like, I've never been to Indonesia, I've never been to Brazil. The fact that I was able to interview with like long distance, telephone or email or whatever, interview people in those places is only thanks to those networks. So, reaching out to other comrades, also getting help with like the translations. I could do, the Spanish translations myself, of course, but like the, Portuguese translations. That was thanks to networks of solidarity that already exist. How do those networks form? In large part, they form out of necessity when there's a lot of repression, or conversely, when all of a sudden a movement takes a big step forward and it breaks new ground, or it gets into territory that hadn't been before. It suddenly has a lot more capacities, and it's excited about this. It wants to share, but it also needs help, doing all the things that need to be done now. Like, for example, if you're going from, just being a group. Well, yeah, to pick a small example, you're just a group that meets sometimes, and then all of a sudden you squat a vacant lot, and you manage to beat the city, and it looks like for now the city's going to leave you alone, and you can make a garden in that space. That's like a whole new capacity. You're going to be really excited about it. You're also going to need a lot more resources and knowledge and people to participate. So you'll put out an invitation, and so similar things happened. The Zapatistas are a great example, or the Kurds fighting, particularly in Rojava. And in those examples, you have both, the side of repression and the side of, breaking new ground or occupying new space, operating simultaneously. So those movements, put out calls for international solidarity, and to a pretty decent extent, they've gotten it. And so when people travel to places like that, they make new relationships. I really believe that. So first of all, you have to be interested. A lot of people, especially in the global north, are very interested in living in their little bubble, or they're not that interested in things happening elsewhere. So there does have to be an impulse towards solidarity and towards global consciousness. But after that, I'd say the most important thing that is devalued a lot is like relationships. Solidarity is much stronger and more effective when it's based on real relationships. You mentioned fissures. I mean, there's always going to be, conflicts in social movements. Sometimes these conflicts are really generative and healthy. Sometimes they're extremely destructive, and movements end up destroying themselves. And very frequently, repressive strategies by governments encourage and play up those conflicts. For example, COINTELPRO in the U.S. in the 70s being extremely effective at getting movements to eat themselves, to destroy themselves. So that's something people have to watch out for. When solidarity is based on like actual human relationships and high quality relationships, then you have better access to knowledge, because you have a better idea of what information you can trust. You have stronger motivations for solidarity and more effective solidarity, because what folks in a different place actually need. Of course, no one person can have personal relationships with other people in all over the world. We can't travel that much. We're also limited in our emotional capacity of how many people we can be friends with. But if you look at it mathematically, like if in every I think for the most part in Europe and North America, we don't have real communities. I think we're too alienated to have actual communities. But in any radical scene, if just any radical scene has 10 to 20 people who at some point in their lives have done like a more extensive solidarity trip to somewhere else in the world, and spent enough time there to learn the language, to make friends, to understand the history and what's actually going on, then back in your scene, you're like, if this is happening all over the world, then mathematically, just like that network expands exponentially, and you're going to be within 2 degrees of separation of someone on any continent, anywhere else where there's some kind of popular struggle against capitalism. And that's actually really, really potent. And I think that's a strong basis for solidarity. Too often folks from the global north, when we travel as tourists, even if it's revolutionary tourists, and we understand ourselves as individuals and not as part of collectives. So we don't tend to collectivize the context that we make, and we don't tend to collectivize our experiences. And so that's one really important thing that we need to do. And the other thing, I'd be really remiss if I didn't mention the huge role that migrants play in building these international networks. And so that's largely from the global south to the global north. And these are folks who do often the most important work in creating that global solidarity and also spreading global awareness of problems and struggles around the world. So that also underlines the importance of solidarity with migrants and action against borders around the world.
Thanks, Peter. David, you're on stack, and after you, David, is Michael Dola, and after Michael is Kate. So go ahead, David. I know you have to leave early, but
yeah, I have to leave in a few. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, good. I was wondering how you imagine, especially just take the case study of Catalonia where you're living now, how you would imagine a transition to the kind of society that you're taking place. That's the thing that often seems very difficult for me to understand, because it would seem that it would and of course this is true of more traditional Marxist approaches to the idea of socialism too, but you could have a revolution in one place and that might change social relations in that one place. They still have to deal with the rest of the world that maybe that hasn't happened. And so you said places like Catalonia have an industrial infrastructure that they could put into use, but that industrial infrastructure has to get its raw materials from someplace else. So are they going to buy the raw materials? Or, I mean, could you see where I'm going with this? I just wondering what your thoughts are, and I may not be able to hear all of your answer, but because I have to leave at 5, but thank you.
I'll try to be more concise than I've been so far. So that's a really good question. I think first off, it's important that we maintain a strong commitment to the idea of global revolution. That the revolution in one country is not in the midterm going to be possible. And so, of course, early in the 20th century, at a certain point, there was a strategic decision, within the Communist Party to opt for like a strategy of socialism in one country. And I think we can see in retrospect that that's not going to work, and it's going to subsume actually revolutionary practices to geopolitical considerations that are ultimately going to be identical, no matter who's at the helm of a particular state. So it will be uneven. I mean, obviously, if there were a global revolution, it wouldn't, happen all at the exact same moment around the world. But we have seen, for example, that there are these sort of waves of revolutionary struggle that get stronger in many countries at once, even when these countries are experiencing very, very different conditions. Like for example, between 2008 to 2012, 14. You saw these huge upsurges in resistance within countries that were experiencing economic growth, in countries that were experiencing total economic collapse. From Turkey to Brazil, really simultaneously. And I think it would just be our responsibility to push that further and to encourage that these processes become global as much as possible. As far as like the more specific question you asked, like with like the factories, like if workers were able to take over their factories, how would they get the raw materials? That's a really good question. I think we can get some good examples to kind of flesh out a response to that with the experience of the worker managed factory movement in Argentina, who really had to deal with that question with it. You had like dozens, more than 100 workplaces that were organized by the workers themselves, but they were doing that ultimately within a capitalist economy. And so they still had to deal with like questions like supplies and all that. And so on the one hand, I think it illustrates that logistically it's possible that they didn't, in general they weren't falling apart because they couldn't provision themselves, or because they couldn't organize themselves to gain access to those resources. And then the limitations or failings of that movement underscore the importance of no peace with capitalism. That these revolutionary movements, they need to spread throughout the world system, or eventually they're going to stagnate and they're going to get reabsorbed into capitalism. So those self-organized workplaces, the worker self-organization, it wasn't a weakness, it wasn't a fatal flaw. They were able to organize themselves. That wasn't a problem, and they were even able to organize themselves within and against the scarcities imposed by capitalism. And they were able mostly to maintain like enthusiasm, a sort of revolutionary enthusiasm of like, you know, believing in like a different way of living and organizing, you know, work and survival and all the rest for at least a few years. But over time, like that eventually gets sapped, and you know, in the end, you get just like a sort of alternately organized capitalist economy or capitalist workplace. And you'll have a few exceptions that really, you know, manage to kind of stick to their principles for longer. So I think what that speaks to is that, you know, you'll have a certain window of opportunity to make a bigger transformation. But it's absolutely vital to push for that bigger transformation, because there's no possibility for like a long-lasting peace between capitalist and non-capitalist ways of life.
Michael Dolla? Michael?
Thanks, Mike. Yes, sort of trying to take it all in, and I'm a bit slow, so I apologize. Thank you, Peter, so much for what sounds like an immense amount of theoretical and ethnographic work around the world, which is very impressive, and I'm very excited to hear about it. Was kind of, before knowing anything about your project, a bit, honestly, dubious, I guess, based on the title. Like, the solutions already exist, or at least the title for this talk. You hear it kind of echoed in the same, you know, something like what Greta Thunberg, or however you pronounce her name, you know, the sort of more liberal progressive sectors who say, you know, the climate crisis has been solved. We have all the facts and solutions. We just need to wake up and change, that kind of thing. And I'm happy to hear you emphasize that this is not a technical issue. It's not just about unleashing green technologies, but that all of social relations have to change, and it has to, you know, and not socialism in one country, all of those good things that we've learned from, you know, brutal lessons through history that still haunt us. So I really appreciate this. I'm very excited to take up the book if I can, and more generally. But I guess I'm asking, maybe, you know, keeping in mind it's the Marxist Education Project, I think is the name of it, and that Marx did not say, you know, he famously was like, that this is not about making recipes for the cookshops of the future, but there still is a universalism and, you know, dialectic with the particularities that we're talking about, right? The universalism being, how do we abolish capitalism and capital? Because capital, the accumulation of capital, is the primary problem of, you know, why the environment is degraded. It's about unending accumulation of capital. So if you don't have workers around the world talking about that, you can slip into, I don't know, you know, you probably know a lot more, but like Mondragon or co-ops are going to do it, or somehow we're going to be able to insulate ourselves from socially necessary labor time and competition and all this stuff. So I guess my very long-winded question is, in your travels, how much are you seeing people like Marx being taken up? Not just because he's a great guy, but because he really got at, from my reading, the crux of the problem that we're faced with. Like, is he dismissed as, you know, a crank that was programmatic and vanguardist and all the rest of it that he's been saddled with? Thanks.
So just to let you know, like, in case you don't, like, my background that I'm writing from, and, like, you know, with my participation in social movements is as an anarchist, but also one, you know, with lots of friends and comrades who get a whole lot out of Marxist framework. I would say that a lot of the things that I've seen, like, most maybe most inspiring to people, like if we're talking about like theoretical frameworks, have been particularly a lot of anti-colonial writers coming from different different contexts, whether it's like Frantz Fanon or also racialized writers, for example, in the North American context. So like for a lot of people, I think it really clicks seeing like the human dimension of this problem and like the historical dimension of it. One thing I didn't talk about, which I do discuss in the book, is like a critique of the Anthropocene, like the figure of the Anthropocene as in this is the current geological age, which is defined by human economic activity, and it's a well-meaning figure. These are like scientists, these are geologists who are trying to say, hey, wake up everybody, this is a really big serious problem. It's so huge that like a billion years from now, like this problem will be inscribed into like a layer of bedrock. But it's also really problematic. I mean, it's ultimately like a racist conceptualization, blaming a problem that's been around for a few hundred years on like the human species, which has been around for hundreds of thousands of years. And so really it's using humanity as a stand-in for whatever humans are have been responsible for promoting and extending capitalism in the state. And so that like kind of being able to get that historical dimension to it, I think has been like one of the theoretical perspectives that seems to be like most current right now and most inspiring around the world. And that's those are theoretical currents that certainly have inspiration in Marx, in Reclus or Kropotkin or other anarchist thinkers, but have a lot more inspiration in indigenous struggles and like continuing present day indigenous practices, both of resistance and of ecosystemic living in relation with the land. So yeah, like Marx is definitely still present, and Marxist frameworks are still being used. But I would say that like what really feels like for folks who are engaging with theory through reading, I think like a lot of the stuff that seems to be like really relevant nowadays is within like an explicitly anti-colonial framework.
Kate, are you still here?
I am. Thank you.
Turn. Go ahead.
Peter, let me reiterate Michael's enthusiasm about the range and variety of your approaches to this whole conversation and to the research that you did. Michael also mentioned the one word I haven't heard that much during your presentation, which is cooperatives. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more. I'm particularly interested in any cooperative movements that are happening in the rural context. They, despite Mike Davis's City of Slums and the obvious congregation of people moving out of the rural areas into the cities and into a more industrial context, I'm wondering if you are seeing the cooperative movement active in rural areas, but also any other comments you might have about specific cooperative efforts that you have seen in the research you've been doing. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So in Catalonia, where I live now, there are definitely a lot of rural cooperatives. Some of them I would say like consciously aligned within a cooperative movement, which definitely could be said to exist. They like in Catalonia, like also across Europe and other places, and with connections with strong cooperative movements in Latin America, and then other cooperatives are they use the cooperative form as a tool without necessarily holding up cooperatives as a sort of horizon. So, for example, more within the anarchist movement, there are also a lot of rural cooperatives that maybe have criticisms of the limitations of the cooperative form, but see it as like a very useful tool in the present context. And I mean, I should say, like, my relationship with those is not as a researcher. Like, I'm not an academic, for example. It's you know, as a participant. So, for example, on a much more informal level, we engage in like olive harvest every year and other activities around food production, and in a collective way, sharing like the food wealth that we create, and then trying to also enact like a more collective relationship with the land. Oftentimes we're able to squat abandoned land or to take care of abandoned olive trees, because the more that gets industrialized, if it's not on like a flat field, then they're likely to get abandoned. And then to process the oil with like smaller scale oil presses that are more solidaristic, that have some historical connection with the movement, or that are run in a cooperative way. And so that's just kind of done like informally through affinities, and done in connection with with other movement spaces. But then there's also, for example, la CIC, La Cooperativa Integral Catalana, so the Catalan Integral Collective, and that that could be said certainly to be to constitute like a sort of formal cooperative movement that I think puts a lot more emphasis on the cooperative form. Whereas, for example, within the anarchist movement in Catalonia, we're encouraging the use of what we're considering sort of like anti-capitalist infrastructures, and we try to make like contextually appropriate decisions for what's the most effective organizational tool for this project or the other project, but then always linking it back into to a more explicitly anti-capitalist movement that also puts a lot of emphasis on attacking capitalist relations, attacking dominant institutions, being in the streets, and stuff like that. And so actually it's a much more quiet part of that movement, like the things that are like addressing collective survival. But it's definitely, I mean, a lot of people are like, I wonder also to what extent the trend towards urbanization might even like boomerang back around in over the next decades. It seems to already be happening where I live, and in some other places. And I think that would also certainly be consistent with technological changes in capitalism more recently that enable decentralization, like decentralized productive activity, to happen in a way that can still be controlled by by the owners of capital. So that could be happening. But in any case, like a lot of folks are like moving out of the city and finding places where they can live with like cheaper rent, less reliance on wage labor, and then also like as we get older, questions of like long-term care within movements, against burnout, against the trauma of repression, or just how we often like treat each other really poorly in movements, or stuff like that. So a lot of these a lot of the value, I think, in these projects that tend to be cooperatives or collectives, or within that spectrum, is just how they allow us to like access abundance that's like outside of and against capital, how they allow us to like take care of ourselves in a collective way that allows us to like survive past that like initial 10 years of like meetings, protests, meetings, protests, and burnout. So yeah.
Could I ask a follow-up question? Are you finding a difference in the sense of community? Because that's a key element in what you've been talking about, is that those connections, those interpersonal connections that people are able to develop. Are you finding a difference in the kinds of developments of that sense of community, either in the rural context as opposed to the more urban industrial context? Is there more potential, say, in I hate to say back to the land movement, but or at least I hate to call it that, but still, is there more potential in that effort than there is in a rat race urban kind of lifestyle?
Yeah. Maybe like if you're looking at like very high rent cities with fewer spaces, fewer neighborhoods that are kind of allowed to fall through the cracks. If anything, I would say that the divide I notice is not between rural and urban space, but it's related to whiteness. Before I mentioned that I don't think that we actually typically have communities. I think it's like a word that gets misused a lot. And I think one of the main features of whiteness is just alienation, just constantly reproducing social alienation, in using alienation now in a way that that Marx probably didn't, but yeah, I think everyone probably understands what I'm saying. And so, like, one of the problems with like back to the land movements is, if thinking in a European context, not even thinking about all the problems that they can run into in in like a settler state in North America. I think a lot of the times people confuse affinity with community. Like right now I live in a neighborhood, it's like a very low income neighborhood. It's like a few apartment blocks that are kind of like a bit marginalized and set aside. Half of the apartments are squatted, the other half are rented. And it's, a lot of like undocumented people, a lot of single moms, a lot of, everyone in the neighborhood is low income. And at times when the neighborhood has been threatened, because the city government would love to just like bulldoze the entire neighborhood, at times when it's been threatened, like we've had like a very vibrant neighborhood assembly that comes up, that resists, that creates a sense of cohesion, that does fundraisers, that does protests, and that blocks the city's plans to screw us over somehow. But in reality, like most of the people, like the people in the neighborhood, like really hate like a lot of other people in the neighborhood. There's no affinity. There's a lot of bad blood. But we come together when like the whole is threatened. We could certainly benefit from having like good conflict resolution mechanisms and like ways of like dealing with like drug mafias and stuff like that. We don't have those. We'd be much stronger with it. But I think that comes much closer to being an actual community than a sort of back to the land group of like 10 friends who are all think the same way. I think community should be defined on the basis of mutual survival, and not like if you actually like depend on other people there for your survival. And like lately with friends, I've been joking like it's not a community unless you hate some of the other people that live there. But despite that, you still stay there, because the typical story of like the Back to the Land project is once you get a conflict, like people went there thinking that they're going to be super besties with best friends with everyone, and everything was going to be perfect and hunky-dory, and the ties that bind them together are not strong enough to outlast a conflict. So when there's a conflict, someone has to leave, and then eventually the whole thing falls apart until it's just like 2 or 3 people living there that are one person who's in perfect agreement with himself, and so there's no more conflict. It's not a community unless there's stronger ties that bind people together, for better and for worse, because being bound to a group of people or to a location isn't always pretty.
Michael Dola, you're there, but before you, Michael, is there anyone who has not asked a question or made a comment who would like to? Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks again, Michael. Yeah, who was it, Sartre or Camus who said hell is other people? But it's really, really important that part of it. So I'm glad you talked about that. Building our abilities to like problem solve within movements and criticize within movements in principled ways, without it dissolving, right? Something that, like, I wish Occupy Wall Street had obviously continued on in other forms. Everybody does once the occupation was, the encampments were, swept up. But there was also, the kind of like inability to form longer term organizations out of that. And I think that's a big part of it, was that it's just kind of like interpersonal issues, and that plagues movements, up until today and prior to Occupy, obviously. But not to go too far on a tangent, you did make me think about the line, when we were talking about all of the sort of like defensive campaigns, like let's stop the airport from being built, let's stop this parcel of land from being developed, or that is so they're so necessary, those struggles, obviously, but they're also very vulnerable, right? That it just is a reflection of us being on our heels in a lot of ways, and makes me think of the line that so that the IRA or something said about the British like police or intelligence services, like, you have to be lucky all the time. We only have to be lucky once. And I tell you, losing a local struggle to like keep a wetland, which is now completely like, was all the acres of trees, this is on Staten Island, Michael, were razed to the ground, is really depressing and very like demobilizing, and you have to gather up yourself. Yeah, that kind of sort of struck me. I did notice that you had some critical things to say about the more liberal groups' relation to violence, nonviolence, which is also a relation to whiteness, to bring up back a term that you were talking about in terms of community. So can you talk a little bit about what you think of as like self-defense and what is needed in terms of like a broad reorientation? It seems to me to be intimately connected to whether or not you think like a revolution is necessary. Mm-hmm. Sorry for this, again, jumble of thoughts, but very generative. Thanks.
So yeah, I'm definitely critical of nonviolence, and particularly groups like Extinction Rebellion that came on the scene with sort of trying to deploy another iteration of like this kind of color revolution approach, which I think we can, that's like that case has been definitively made about how those color revolutions are like necessarily based on like a superficial model of social change, mobilizing the media around empty slogans and trying to get enough support either to create a political crisis or to win an election or something like that. And this is a method that was based on Gene Sharp's work that ultimately just becomes like the most superficial form of nonviolence that exists. It's definitely the dominant form that exists today, and it's one that's connected only to social change that is completely compatible with the interests of the dominant layers of society or dominant institutions. In fact, it came out that one of the main groups promoting the sort of color revolution models was actually working with U.S. intelligence, and so like an emphasis on nonviolence is very critical to that, because it prevents movements from getting out of control. It makes it easier for movements to be packaged for the media, and so on and so forth. I think self-defense is an important value, an important practice, especially if we understand it in collective terms rather than individual ones. I also don't think that it should be like a limit to our movements. I don't think there's anything wrong with attacking a system that is just so destructive to life and happiness and freedom and the ecology and all the rest. So as an anarchist, it's no surprise that I'm critical of a separation between means and ends, but that's because I think that it's not just an ethical question, but that like the means that you use are always going to be reflected in the ends that you create, and so I think it is important in social movements that aspire to be revolutionary to have some kind of question, not just about the efficacy of tactics, but whether you prefer to look at it as like the ethics of those tactics, or whether you prefer to think about it as like the being realistic about the kinds of social relations that you would actually produce through using certain methodologies of struggle. I think that's really important. I think that can be done. That can't really be done effectively using the criterion of violence, since violence it's such an imprecise term. It's it's kind of morally coded. It's extremely contextual. No two groups of people have the same definition of what constitutes violence. I think looking at how authoritarian tactics are is really important. whether a tactic is spreading power throughout society, throughout the lower classes to organize their own lives, or whether a methodology of struggle is limiting that. So, for example, when you look at Fanon's discussion of violence, he obviously has no rejection of armed struggle against colonialism, but he looks at this common dynamic of parties that will make an initial foray into armed struggle and then ultimately move towards more pacifying methodologies because they don't want to lose control of their struggle, and they want to demonstrate to the colonizer that they can be responsible governors, that they can be a new governing class, and they can be trusted with control of the colony. They can be, the colonizers can hand over control of their project to this supposedly anti-colonial force. And so it is really interesting how violence and then nonviolence comes in to that analysis that Fanon makes. So I would look at that and kind of take that approach and go even further with it to look at whether a method of struggle is compatible with broad self-organization across the society, or whether it's trying to limit the tools of struggle within the hands of a party or within the hands of a more elite group that can be institutionally controlled. And if we want to talk about ethics, like I would say that there's a huge there's a huge difference between in a U.S. city, someone in the present context, the present environment, killing a cop, given the kinds of things that police are doing every day of the year. There's a huge difference between imagining some revolution where the police in a city have already been defeated, and then going around and arresting everyone who had previously worked as a cop, and then killing them. So in both cases, we're dealing with another human being is getting killed. In one of them, they're being killed by someone who has very little power and is in the situation of having much less power. In the other situation, it's sort of like this determination that this from the group that at that point has all the social power, deciding, well, you no longer deserve to live. And I think that those are very, very different activities and the kind of social relations that they could potentially produce. But yeah, so it's a rather bloody example, but hopefully one that makes sense.
So one of the things that happens with me when I'm trying to promote an event like your book, Peter, I look at what I can get from Pluto, and I was very struck by you bringing up there are people in the Amazon, one of our most biodiverse parts of the planet, that is being systematically exploited, burned. I don't think we understand the level of destruction there. And also the entire Indonesian set of islands. I don't know. There must be 14,000. I'm not Wikipedia. I don't know how many islands, but there's a tremendous number of islands. And then just Googling images about what your book is about, my screen was like a forever screen. There is so much activity. I was truly astonished. Unfortunately, Corbis and Getty, they own too many of the images, and I'm afraid of you. There is some great images, and I grabbed a few that I think are not copyright protected. We've been attacked for taking copyright images. But what struck me most about the images I saw from Indonesia is that they're in the context of a country where the U.S. colluded with the fascists more than 50 years ago and had a thoroughgoing extermination of anyone on the left. They didn't care where you were, or even if you were sympathetic or not critical enough, you could be taken out of your house and murdered. And I think that the U.S. was responsible with the Indonesians for 500,000 people dying in a very short period of time. Yet, in the past year, unlike anyone expected, workers at factories all over Indonesia went out on this huge general strike that was not just a symbolic general strike, but was a real demand going on. And then when I saw the images related to countering the palm oil plantations, I started wondering, is the consciousness of those people, the indigenous in the rural areas, protecting the rich biodiversity, is their consciousness becoming part of the working class consciousness in the towns? Is there, I mean, I'm trying to build connections that may or may not be there, but I'm wondering if you have any idea if that is developing there, or I'm sure in Brazil the workers' movements are in some ways tied in with the indigenous movements to protect the Amazon. In fact, I've seen evidence of that. But I'm going on too much. It would be great to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, the comrade that I interviewed in Indonesia is a Dayak anarchist who lives in the city, grew up mostly in the city. So he is indigenous, but he didn't grow up in the rural communities in Kalimantan in Borneo, which is like the largest island. And so he's like I guess one of these folks that you could also kind of look at as like, you know, having crossed borders, and so has like a foot in multiple worlds. So he has, you know, he has relatives, he has like the close contacts in Dayak communities in the highlands that are, you know, fighting to protect the forest and protect their gardens against the palm oil plantations, and that are still dealing with, you know, the remnants of that state violence that you know, the United States and Indonesian governments unleashed during the Cold War. And he also has you know, connection with urban anti-capitalist movements. So there are definitely like you know, it ends up happening, you know, these very human ways of like, you know, people who have like a foot in two different worlds and can kind of serve as conduits for that. So that's like, never having been to Indonesia, you know, won't offer more, but like that's, you know, the one person or I talked with several people in order to get in touch with this one comrade, but yeah, the person I interviewed for the book is a perfect example of that.
Great. Michael, you typed something here. Oh. Well, yeah, that's an idea. Anyone who has not spoken yet who would like to ask a question, or Kate, do you have anything more to comment on? Well, I do want to make sure that everyone knows the book is available. And if you go to Pluto's website and put in the letters MEP, you will get a discount. I don't know if that cuts into your royalties, Peter. I know that your royalties do not go to you. They go to, I'm sorry, I wasn't, at the same time, a lot of lefties now steal books or bootleg them from, you know, various sites. But I do feel left publishers need to be able to survive, so I encourage people to buy books in one way or the other rather than bootleg them. In this pandemic, it's not necessarily easy for many working class people to buy books, but we cannot support the spread of these ideas unless we support authors like you or the causes that you're supporting through your writing.
Like you mentioned, in this case, all the royalties from the book go to projects that participated with interviews in Brazil and in Indonesia.
That's great. That's really great.
We need to fundraise for info shops to keep the left publishing industry alive.
Yes. Claire?
Hey, Peter, my name is Claire. I live in Ithaca in Cayuga land, and I'm a friend of your mother.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Claire. Okay, hey, how's it going?
Nice to meet you. And there was so much that you offered, and thanks to Michael for holding this space for this kind of conversation and sharing. And I'm not literate in a lot of Marxist stuff, but I relate to many of the principles. And really, I liked the for better or for worse part, because like wherever you are, wherever you're living, if you don't have relationship with your neighbors for 30 years or whatever, where you like sometimes have anyway, I don't have a prepared remark, but I just could really relate to that part. I grew up in the Bronx, and I think we were all like first or second generation from another place where there was community. Mm-hmm. And there's in this place where I'm living now, it's hard to find that organically. But I live on the west side of town where it happens with some intentionality. I guess that piece of anti-colonialism really speaks to me, and where I live, the Cayugas are returning, and that is complex. And also, that's a very, the Haudenosaunee, the way of peace is that we respect, or try to respect in those relationships, is very slow. And even when there's this really big belligerent guy that uses weapons, and the clan mother just employed her 85 pounds of nonviolent resistance with the guy, and nothing was forced, even between, anyway. So there's a lot to learn from the First Nations people where we are living, to go forward on this planet in more proper relationship or right relationship. But anyway, thanks for putting so much into it and bringing us all the way to Catalan. Just a tiny little thing to add that's popping up. There's a friend here who wrote a book about struggles on the west coast of Ireland, where my grandparents are from, that experienced the death threats and the imprisonment and the whole thing, that even happening in what you might call a first world setting, with the indigenous fishermen or whatever, that same thing is happening even in places like that. And then in places like Vieques, where there was that successful thing, but even if it was short-lived, because then the corporate buying of that seafront on that beautiful island, Isla Nena, there's something to that. And like Standing Rock, and places where the struggles may not seem to have been effective, or rather successful, that's the word I mean, that never to discount the value of tasting something for so many people. And just being, I wasn't trying to go to Standing Rock myself, but I was kind of pushed into it. And then the Red Warrior Collective asked for people who did certain things, church people, whatever. So I ended up going there twice, but I was struck the first time, like, oh, this is a sort of decolonized space. Everybody is fed, everybody is given a place to sleep, everybody is encouraged to respect the sort of agreement of how you be there. Anyway, just putting, and also I was quite taken by the power of symbolic action there, that it wasn't all about the efficiency action, but that there was reverence for the sacred action of symbolic. And that is something I'd like to reclaim for all people. Because quantifying things in the whiteness Western mind is a deadly thing. It's something to decolonize ourselves from. And these relationships with the creator and creation, even though I appreciate scientists, it's part of what's killing us, I think, to narrow it down into this measurement or think we know everything. And I guess maybe just listening, and I have all these pages of notes, is that I know very little, actually, but I'm so glad to listen, and thanks for putting the energy in, and thanks for Michael hosting it.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you everyone who came today. Um, and remember now, the other thing about you, Peter, is did you help A.K. Thompson with keywords for radicals?
I wouldn't say that I helped. I wrote an entry. So I have an entry in A.K. Thompson's book.
Oh,
yeah.
what entry? What word? I don't mean to put you on the spot, even if you did it.
If I'm not remembering incorrectly, it's been a while since I looked back. I think on violence. I think.
Ah, okay. I have a copy somewhere in my morass of books here.
Yeah.
But, so thank you everyone for being here. And again, Peter, thank you for putting the time into putting this book together and doing these interviews and making it available to everyone in the world.